I was born a poor black child. No, that's I had to do it. I've been thinking about that for a while. I had to do it. In the spring of, it was the spring of 1990. I was 32 years old. My wife, Karen, and I were taking a trip to Toronto, Canada, just for the weekend to get away. In those days, you were able to get into Canada with just a copy of your birth certificate. Being a last minute type of guy, I waited until the last minute, the day before we were actually leaving, to look through my personal papers for my birth certificate. It wasn't in my desk drawer. It wasn't in the unlocked little fireproof safe we kept behind the curtain. In fact, it wasn't anywhere in the house. So I went down to the Bureau of Vital Statistics and I waited in line and I waited in line and I waited in line. So finally, I was standing in front of the clerk window and I asked for a copy of my birth certificate. My name, Chester Mitchell Jackson. Date of birth, January 22nd, 1958. Birthplace, New York City. And finally, my mother's name, Geneva Jackson. Yeah, it is a pretty name. The clerk is typing this all in, type, 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 type. She looks up at me, looks back at the screen, type, 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 type. And she looks at me and says, any other names? Any other names? No, no, that's my information. She looks back, she types some more, looks back at me, types some more, and says, you're not in there. What do you mean I'm not in there? I guess she was sensing my irritation. So she does one of these, telling me to come closer. I lean into the small plexiglass window and she says, pointing at a phone on the wall, go over there, pick up that phone, call your mother and ask her what name is on your birth certificate. That probably should have been a clue. I was a bit miffed, like a grumpy teenager, I think. I said, okay. So I go over to the phone. I pick up the phone. I dial my mother. Hello? I say, Mom, I'm over here in the Bureau of Vital Statistics, trying to get a copy of my birth certificate. The clerk told me to ask you what name is on my birth certificate. Nothing, not a peep. I was like, yeah, mother, this should not be a difficult question. Again, it's an audible silence. And finally she says, tell them to try Desi Lee Mitchell. Desi Lee Mitchell? What? I said, who the blank is Desi Lee Mitchell? Another pause. I'm like, Ma? She sighs heavily and says, it doesn't matter. She's been dead a long time now. In that instant, I was a little kid again, remembering when my older brother told me in all seriousness, Mommy found you in the trash and brought you home. I remember running to my mother and asking her, was that true? Her answer, a curt, well, what do you think? I could sense her unhappiness simply by me asking the question. So I went silent. I shut the door where all my hurt lived, thereby keeping the terrible secret at bay. Now, as a grown man, I continue to shut the door. I say, okay, thank you, and I hang up. I make my way back to the clerk. She's looking at me with an expression on her face that said, oh Lord, here's another one. I guess my face betrayed my confusion, and I tell her, try Desi Lee Mitchell. She goes back to her keyboard. She, kind of shook her head, shaking her head. And I said, okay, I need a copy of the birth certificate. With her eyes still down, she asked, do you have any identification in this name? I said, no. I don't even know who that is, I'm thinking to myself. After a few awkward moments of her staring at me, she says, you could get into Canada with a copy of your voter registration card. With that piece of wisdom tucked in my pocket, I turn around and leave. I go back home. My wife asks, "Did you get your birth certificate?" No. I tell her the story. We go off to Canada. I don't call my mother back. I don't run down there and find out what's going on. I just put my head down, keep trudging forward. I keep going silent. I had all kinds of theories about what was happening, but my wife knew there was only one explanation, the one I refused to recognize. "I'll bet you're adopted," she said over and over and over again. I just couldn't wrap my head around the idea of being adopted. I mean, if that's true, if I was somehow adopted, who am I? In any event, we spend our 2 days, 2 somber days, I might add, in Canada. We come back. I immediately hightail it up to my mother's apartment on 135th Street. I let myself in. I find her on her bed, smoking a cigarette, watching The Price is Right. I come in, I sit down on the little chair that was there for me to sit when I came to visit, and I'm watching Bob Barker too. I sat there in front of my mother, waiting patiently like a child on Christmas morning, full of anxious anxiety and anticipation. We stared at one another for a moment. I smiled my most reassuring smile. My mother groaned and looked away. She took a long, noisy breath, sat up, stone-faced like a prisoner before the parole board, handed me a carefully folded document, averting any eye contact. I sat holding my birth certificate, a literal cloud of Bel Air cigarette smoke and my mother's palatable fear hanging like one more invisible weight around my neck. On the brink of long overdue answers to questions too big to be asked in childhood. I felt light as a feather, deep cleansing breaths, joyful vindication, almost too much to hide. I was born again in that moment, whole in an instant. A lifetime spent wondering what was wrong with me had unconsciously been heavy as hell. Despite numerous protestations to the contrary, no one could ever convince me that there wasn't something terribly off kilter in my house. So I sit, relieved that what I dreaded, consciously and unconsciously, was merely a matter of me misreading my mother's anxiety and fear. I was not defective. I was not incapable of making something in my life. I was free. "Don't hate me," she whispered. "Don't hate me." I shifted to embrace my mother with peace in my heart and a smile on my face, holding what felt like the most truth I had ever known. My mother nestled against my shoulder, ashamed and broken. The curtain had been removed, and there she sat, judged and sentenced. My mother's eyes told me that she could not handle my rejection that day. I sucked up my glee, and I assured her that no piece of paper could ever erase a lifetime of love and devotion. Shame filled the room like tear gas, making it hard for either of us to breathe. I held my mother, hoping to comfort and shield her from the death of her lie. The most hurtful thing of all will always be her openly grieving the fact that she was not allowed to go to her grave with the lie intact. Somehow it seemed she believed that our mother-child bond was held together by the lie instead of the opposite. The lie created the only fissure in our bond, a hairline fracture that never got a chance to truly heal because the pain was never tended to. We never spoke of how selfish I thought it was that a child's greatest protector would willfully turn their back on this gigantic parental responsibility, to condemn her beloved child, me, to never knowing where they came from or to whom they belonged seemed incredible to me. When I think about adoption and adoptees coming out of the fog, it truly was a fog for me. Even as I found myself working in adoption, I was able, fortunately, to find supportive people to explore this new reality. Over the years, swinging wildly from jilted child, lied to over and over, to otherwise loved and cared for child, grateful for all I was given. All of it centered around my birth, one woman's decision to give me up, and another woman's decision to take me in. No parent has the right to deny their child the opportunity to know their own birth story and family history. Just because you feel the need to cry about it doesn't give you the right to lie about it. Both my mothers managed to take the secrets of their bond to their graves. All I could do was live in the wake of their choices. The answer to the question, who am I? I'm Chester Mitchell Jackson, the seventh child born to Desi Lee Mitchell, taken in and raised by Geneva Jackson. And I know both my mothers loved me, did the best they could. But love is not enough. Knowing the truth is better.